recently. I studied what now it's called the Architectural Technologies postgraduate of the EDGE programs. I did the last year of the ESTM. And then I stayed in LA for 3 more years. I came back last year. And then I was also teaching at SCI-Arc with Casey, actually. We did one final studio of the same program, the Architectural Technologies. Then I was helping Willy Mueller. He was a visiting professor, so I was sort of the person here for him when he was abroad. That was a vertical studio. We were doing like speculative urbanism. And now I'm teaching here at University of Buenos Aires, what I did before going there, and I'm back here now. So that's sort of it. And SCI-Arc was absolutely great. Honestly, it changed my point of view on practically everything. We are very old school here, so it was awesome.
Awesome, thank you. And so Mira Henry has joined also. Hey, Mira.
Hey, team.
So we are just starting now, and I thought that the first thing we can do is just have our guests introduce themselves briefly, and then we can go into thesis, you know. So we had Augustina introduce herself, and now we can go to Enrique, and then Jeff, and then William, just to follow the alphabetic order that I just now, you know, figured out maybe. Let's see.
Thank you for having me. I'm Enrique Agudo. I did MArch 2 in SCI-Arc, and then did the fiction entertainment program with Liam Young. And yeah, I mean, certainly SCI-Arc has been a big part of my life and sort of my trajectory. One of the projects that I started off at SCI-Arc was a VR film that I did with Liam. I then developed that further and have been doing the film festival circuit, being selected at Tribeca and Venice. And we continue to promote it and work on it. And the hustle never ends, but definitely, you know, practicing more experimental and less traditional forms of architecture has really shaped how I see the world, and definitely has changed my perception of what architecture is and how we can think of architecture and the future of our cities.
So thank you. Great.
Hey everyone, Jeff Halstead. I graduated from SCI-Arc in 2014, MArch, and was working at Gary Partners for a few years before I started teaching at the University of Michigan. My research was kind of recently based off of turning some of those form-making processes from Gary Partners and like coding them and using kind of gestural actions and a particular set of processes to mimic some of those things and look at ways of turning them into bits of code and macros and thinking about, you know, physics simulation in relation to material and how those things can scale up. Thanks.
Hi everyone, my name is William Virgil. Graduated 2016 from MArch. After that, I stayed at SCI-Arc. I was a TA. I did a vertical studio as a TA, as a assistant teaching with Frank Gehry. And then after that, I went to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where I'm a lecturer. I teach thesis, vertical studios, and seminars. Great to be here with all these beautiful people that I remember from SCI-Arc. Hi, Jeff. Hi, Enrique. Hi, Mira.
Hey, Virgil.
Hi, Casey.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. This was really, really great. And so we have 3 basically groups of students today. Casey's group, which has, I think, 4 students. And then my group will have 4. And then Mira's, there will be a student in Mira's group eventually, like in the end. So we can just start with Casey's group. And maybe if Casey wants to say something beforehand, or we can just jump into the student presentations.
I mean, can I just make a quick thing to the group out of respect? I have a program running right now, so I'm going to be in this group, but then if you see me pop out and pop in, it's not personal. I have to manage some things. So just so you know, if you see me and then don't see me, that's what's taking place.
Hi, Mira.
Hey, Jeff.
Well, let's just go then. I think Ken's first, right?
Okay.
I mean, these guys all know thesis, so they know the drill.
Sure, I will time it for 20 minutes total. So, you know, when the time is up, I will say it. Yeah.
Okay. I think I'm first, right?
Yeah, please show your face on the camera if you can.
Oh,
This goes
okay.
for every student. It's just a more immediate experience if we can see you.
Okay. I'm logging in like in 2 accounts, so because the one has my face on it.
If it's not technically possible, then that's okay.
His face is on.
It's okay. Okay. Hi guys. I'm Lawrence, and then yeah, I'm in Casey's group, and then my thesis is called alienation. And then so I'm using a neural network to represent all the features that social media has generated of what architectural images is, and then use this platform to generate three-dimensionalized form from it. And then this interface also allows users to navigate the hyper-dimensional space that represents all the labor. So first, by feeding images in a start position and end position, the AI will morph them and then generate results image. And users can control the sliders with different features that are being added on to those images. And then they can change the vector's position with the wheel to manipulate the morphing results. And after that, the platform will transform the result images into 3D objects. And then they can start to explore the transformation object. And then through intuitively navigating them in the scene. And then they can also like go back to the previous pages to kind of like recompute it with different settings for inputs to kind of steer these things around in this platform. Because the ultimate goal is to generate architectural form with this platform by projecting inputs images into the latent space, and then designers can exploit like these materials that we put on the internet to make their designs. Because this neural network dataset is trained on an architectural social media, so users can feed in example images, and then it'll find something like it inside the network. So the users can start to affect the transformation. And then this idea is based on the thesis statement from my previous semester's project, which argues the idea of when big data and cloud computing become the dominant rules, our control and knowledge over the digital environment are undermined. And this digital alienation is the product of the unequal power structures that intentionally deny users control. And this manipulation fits Marx's definition of alienation, as in a strained power system working against individuals. So through using this platform, users can be able to regain control or authorship back to themselves to rebuild like value. And then, yeah, so I'm using 2 neural network in this platform. One is the image generated that I mentioned, and then the other one is the one that can automatically generate a depth image from a single image. So then I can use the depth map to translate like 2D images into 3D meshes. Yeah, that's it.
Hey, Lawrence, can you restate your thesis again?
Sure. it's called alienation, and then it's the idea is like when the digital environment, like the data and like these AI are like the dominant rules are like control and knowledge or ownership over them are like being undermined. But so I'm trying to use this platform to kind of like rebuild those things back, like to kind of like allow the users to start to have a certain amount of control over those things, these digital things.
Okay, so if you're looking to give control to the users, and you are using the neural network to analyze these images, what set of boundaries are you giving the network so that they can judge what will be a good quality versus something that might not work?
There's actually not yet having a boundary for this thing yet, because the data set it was like trained on a very like the data set is like vast. So I think that's like I think that's more like the problem that I'm also having right now, and then I'll try to like manage that after this, because once people start to use these things to like make things, there must be some kind of like criteria or like rules set. So yeah, so beyond, honestly, like that's still I haven't like fully figured out yet.
Hey man, and you know, that's okay, because you know you're still at the stage where you are figuring out the steps. But my comment is more towards you know, whenever we tend to start the making, usually we forget that the making, even though we understand our process and the components that we are using to you know, produce this amazing form that you know you are about to complete, and you know, I know this is going to look fantastic by the end of it. You have to create a set of guidelines in which you control the outcome by being able to recognize what's good versus what's not. Because you know, usually when we're doing computer generated images, you know, it's easy to just like, you know, pull out an outcome. And you know, oftentimes we the first thing we get, because it looks a certain way, we you know, if you like it, you tend to go with that. But you have to give yourself some sort of parameters so that you are able to judge what's good versus what's bad, and why you pick this form versus that form. And then, you know, whenever you talk about your project, you're able to set the project in a way in which you can start talking about you know, things that you tried and things and things that didn't work, and how you were able to recognize, you know, this system was better than that system, and how this system is giving actually power to the people, right? So maybe by you giving the system a set of rules, and you know, you will identify that at some point, you're able to say, I gave the system this set of rules, and this is what's giving the power to the people, and you know, that will help you out in the argument.
Gosh. I mean, I think, William, like that's a kind of like an interesting point moving forward. You know, up to this point, the emphasis is like this apparatus that Lawrence has built is what allows you to operate as a designer in this space. Like these kind of big GANs like this one, which is like, this one's trained on, you know, many months worth of social media scraping of what the internet collectively values architecture is, but it becomes this kind of black box, right? It's like unknowably vast space of possible designs. So what Lawrence has built here is a way for designers to try to intuitively navigate it by feeding it samples of things or features that they think are interesting. So I think, like you're saying, the next step would be, you know, he's doing that through like you feeding it these images to try to project features into the network and locate things or steer paths through that network. But then now would be starting to test, like as a designer would, in a very intuitive way, like how, you know, what are the features that I can start to produce interesting results from those images that I'm feeding it.
Yeah, great. I'm sure it's gonna look awesome. So, you know, keep going, Lauren.
Thank you.
I wonder, Casey, and in that sense, I wonder whether or not the parameters or the it seems like the apparatus is really where a lot of intelligence is, and whether and so from a rhetorical standpoint, and it's Lawrence, right? That's who I'm speaking with, yeah, Lawrence. I think that in terms of how you begin to communicate your thesis, I think that you could spend more time articulating the contribution, the specific contribution that the apparatus is making. Let's just say, what are some of the pitfalls of working on big data and point cloud systems, for instance, and how is this now training something in a new way, right? I think this idea of looking at special features, for instance, that Casey is suggesting, seems very particular. And so I think that, yes, there will be a question about what you output as being something that you could value one way or the other. I think that there's an aesthetic project that kind of sits, as you described, and it's kind of not sure exactly, a sort of grotesque sublime or sort of mix. But I do think that it would be helpful to, my sense is that there are things to articulate that you haven't yet articulated for the purpose of a broader audience. And I don't mean broad like anybody, but I mean even to get into the game, to talk about how this is, what kind of argument this is making, is to communicate how you are different, how you are working with point cloud systems and big data and AI systems to be able to work in a very particular way. And I didn't, from your presentation, fully get kind of understand the gravity or not understand the gravity of it, but I don't feel like it was clear enough. And I feel like that's really maybe where some of the designerly thinking is actually happening. So I don't, this is maybe one question I would have in terms of your rhetorical approach for understanding. Because I think that when at this stage in thesis, everyone is doing a ton of work. And the question is, where is the thesis thinking? Where does it lie in this, in all of this work? And begin to articulate that as part of, like, what are the questions you are in your process actually establishing, and being able to have some perspective on that early on, like as you work, is incredibly important, not just in terms of output, but in terms of like the actual cognitive work that's taking place to be able to make an argument.
I think these are very interesting points, because I think one of the main problems of, like, let's say, working with machine learning in particular is this idea of explainability of models, right? How do models become explainable to the audience in some ways, right? Mm-hmm. And what I think is really cool about this project is that there is an attempt to kind of give some like formal expression to not only to the model itself, but to the interaction model behind it, right? So in this idea of like constructing a user interface that becomes part of the project, right? It's not only the models that you're making, but it's also the user interface, the platform, which I think is is an attempt to kind of construct explainability of something that is not really easily given to explainability, you know? But I think what Mira is saying is super interesting to me, is because like there are different audiences, right? And the audience of architects would maybe expect some other format of explainability or some other like model of engagement. And maybe that's something to think about, like how does that translate into a disciplinary position? Because I think all of these platforms, they have a capacity to produce many different audiences. And you don't have to shy away from constructing a specific kind of interface for someone who's an architect, right? Or in this way, because this mapping will, the mapping of the interaction model will give you exactly, at least partially, the kind of the cultural, outcome for the project, which I think is happening. And then one thing is for me is a bit unclear, is the relationship between the model itself, which one of the main problems with ML stuff is how to make stuff spatial, how to make things into an object. And that's, you kind of have solved this in many ways. You have this really interesting idea of combining multiple views or kind of producing something like this. But I'm not sure about the particles and how does that work, because I think at this point they are a rhetorical device. This is more like what we wish it was actually happening there, like latent space folding into itself to produce this kind of like shiny things. But I think it's a cool effect anyway.
I actually think that the project very much stands out for me because of the idea of perception. Obviously, we've created a platform. Well, you've created a platform that formally reads as a suggestion of architecture. But what I find more interesting is the fact that it's presented with those particle systems, almost like it's a shadow or a cloud of something that forms into something that formally looks like architecture, is actually more indicative of what we perceive as architecture, what social media perceives as architecture, which is really, I mean, even though it's quantifiable in data, I do think that it's abstract in its anthropological sense. And so I find that really fascinating, because we're living in a world where we're experiencing architecture mostly through the internet. And so that data actually has a meaning and a cultural impact in how we're perceiving the world. So this is actually, I find, a platform that says more about, an idea of architecture than architecture itself. I think that's brutal in its concept because of the current situation that we're in. So the fact that it's presented with these particle systems that I would love to get into, because they're not only beautiful, but they're also very suggestive of the starting point of the project. I'm really interested in how is this formally successful in that it looks like architecture, but also what is probably most interesting, what is the dissonance or what is the difference between what we perceive as architecture and architecture itself, if that makes any sense. Like, if you can pull apart this model and begin saying like the areas in which it's successful as formally architecture, and it begins being perceptive of architecture. And maybe I'm being a little abstract, but I think that we can go specifically into little parts and sort of see the arches forming and seeing that is maybe more formally architecture, or the tower heaping over the rest of the model. But then we can go into little places where maybe it's a little abstract, or maybe when the particle systems flow in a certain kind of way, they might be suggestive of architecture. I like to see those spots as what we begin thinking of architecture, and what, how we can actually pin those points down, almost like it's a scientific or a very methodical research process through which you actually inform the proper model in a way that you begin creating almost like architecture of dreams, or architecture of abstract architecture that is in our minds that we're only experiencing through these interfaces.
Mm-hmm.
I really like the kind of initial conversation around alienation. I like the ideas of like collective authorship, or like a kind of democratic approach to architecture, or like making architecture through images. And also, the model is quite stunning. But when you're talking about tapping social media as a means to perhaps survey a group and their kind of insight into like what architecture should be, it's kind of indicative of like which side politically a social media platform is leaning. So for instance, if you're just going through like Facebook, in light of recent censorship, they tend to be kind of, you know, right-wing leaning, neoclassical or classical ideals of architecture. Whereas I would assume, you know, a Twitter-based approach perhaps could be, you know, looking at more contemporary aspects of architecture, which could, you know, generate a whole new slew of imagery, right? And so thinking about what you're showing us currently as that model, I just perhaps would be curious to really focus on like what information, who are you looking at, and what are their kind of particular insights into like what architecture should or should not be, or what it is to them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I like that
this is our timer. I just want to say we can continue the conversation in the next project. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think I'm the next. So hi everyone, and let's just get started. Well, so basically I'm developing an AR application which allows the user are able to scan the existing building. So as we know, the technology of augmented reality is getting more important in our life. So we can get some information through these apps, such as navigation of Google Map. So I think AR is that at the right place, right time to get the correct information. And my project, I would like to allow my AR app to kind of represent or rearrange the features of existing buildings in real time to produce organization both of two-dimensional facade and three-dimensional interior, like you see those components. So I think eventually I will have this application allows combining the features of architecture, or like say housing type, to and also use the ability of AR to superimpose the multiple reality corresponding these conditions. So basically, we can right now we can scan it and then reconfigure facade will come out, and then we can pull them out. And then here's my idea of like what kind of housing type should be look like. Yeah, so that's it.
So I'll start if that's okay, and I'll try to connect a little bit Lauren's project with this one since we ran out of time. I think it's interesting what you're doing. I see that everybody's kind of working with user. I mean, giving the user the possibility to modify what it's surround them. I think that this is, I have a question before, like, do you have like different options? Or are you thinking about giving the user different options on how to modify the facades?
Oh,
like sort of different scripts or to create different aesthetics or different geometries?
You mean this facade or this one?
Like no, firstly, the one that you're using, like if you are providing more than one script to modify the images, to make it more interactive in a way, maybe that would be an option. And the second thing that I was gonna sort of ask or suggest is, I think it would be good, maybe actually what exactly you just asked, to probably give the option of creating like an interrelationship between the actual building that you're scanning, and maybe you can scan the building in front or just the surrounding buildings to sort of create like a new reality that interacts with the rest of the context. So it's not happening like within the same image, but actually it's sort of creating maybe a reflection, you know, what buildings, they are like all glass and maybe more or less mirrored. So you start seeing like new images that are coming or from the actual context. I think that would also be very interesting, that you can create like new reflections that can actually interact with the one building that you are working with, if that makes sense. And just to connect it a little bit and continue the conversation with Alienation Project, the one that Lawrence just presented, I think it was the fact that the particles were in motion that was sort of giving the idea that this was an alive system, and that you had the opportunity to keep on adding inputs, to keep on modifying that output. And that for me was very, very interesting. That fact that of course the input was 2D, but the result was 3D, and the fact that you are actually creating a new object. So maybe here this new object could also be receiving multi inputs from the surroundings, and not just working within itself.
I think that one of the interesting things about, you know, the current climate that we're in is that we can continue to do projects that sort of address architecture in a formal way that kind of is really interesting in its process, but maybe it doesn't transcend far more than, you know, formal intervention. But I think that this is a beautiful start to the possibility of actually, you know, speaking out about things that are important to you. And that can be really political, say that through geolocation, there are certain buildings throughout the city that sort of formally change if you you know, put them through this interface. And then maybe the courthouse turns into, you know, a circus because we're commenting on police, or, you know, symbols of oppression can be dismantled through this AR system. So that's a more political side, but you can actually like turn it into a really intricate temple that relates to who you are as a person, or what your beliefs are, or what your heritage is. And I think the opportunity to make this slightly more pronounced in the voice and the sort of tone that it takes, I think will, like, this is already a great setup, but like being more vocal, I think would actually make it a far more complex an interesting project, because it then brings in so many other elements that are sort of laid on a very solid base for what this could be, but then it sort of brings in other you know, political issues that I think are important to be regarding in this time.
Yes.
What I've always found really kind of fascinating about AR is you need to typically download an app if you're in a gallery and like scan a QR code, or there's a trigger involved. And it would be kind of interesting to think about this project in relation to a kind of current building facade and the technology we use. So could it be masked in such a way, or could it have data kind of overlaid? And then when you're like taking a photograph, or when a specific building is being viewed through a camera, these kind of changes occur for a particular reason, right? Like there might be a purpose. Like these could be like sites of subversion, or like sites of camouflage. They could be, they could have a kind of underlying urban or prominent urban location in which its kind of operation needs some level of obfuscation, or is encouraged to be changed in a particular manner. So regardless of what you're looking at it through, it's always kind of reconfigured based off of who's seeing it through whatever camera lens. And then I think you're giving the process, which is really kind of, you know, it's gorgeous, right? So I think through that, you know, you give it perhaps a particular take in which I think you can establish a thesis on.
I have a question about the idea of typology here, and typology and the idea of it, kind of the user, this and what Enrique was saying, the kind of idea of the kind of personal, and then this idea of the typology, and those seems to be kind of, in some way, typology seems to be related to maybe not the personal necessarily, I wonder, like a different kind of role of the architect, thinking about many people at once, versus the sort of very personal. And I think that that's a little unclear to me what the stake is. Like, is it trying to, who are you? Is this about any person? Is this about you as an architectural student? Is this about architectural vision being able to do this work? Or is this about like a total sort of democracy of seeing? And I guess I would say I'm unclear right now. And I think either tack would be quite interesting, but I would think that probably on your next step, you want to kind of clarify that. And then to that end, like how, as you said at the beginning, this idea of also being able to see and augment the interior. And I'm really curious how you, what you think how you would do that. Would it be from, in what form of visualization would that take? Would that be also from Street View? From Street View, you could also start to think about how to see and augment the interior, or is that something, are you looking at your, an egress plan and you start there? Like, how do you see and do the same sort of play, let's say, and envisioning at the interior?
Okay, so I would say, well, I would say like I would like to allow users to know like what is behind of those housing facade, because we can see that a lot of like housing apartment, they got a very linear windows together. So I think another question that would be, I'm thinking the typology about the very future, like what kind of typology will be look like in the future. And this is the kind of I would like to provide it to user and the public or citizens who doesn't study architecture, and they can also use my app to know a little bit about architecture.
So this is about the user, right? The app is for the user. It's not for the architect, if that's what you're saying, right? Because I do think that it was an interesting question that Mira posed with regards to the idea of the generic or the typology, right? Which is, because I think that the model you have right now, the model of interaction you have right now, is based on this idea of going out in the city and kind of doing AR graffiti to the existing buildings, right? Which is an interesting idea, and I think it's. But what if you actually designed the new generic or the new kind of type for the AR overlay, and then the business model that you offer becomes this idea of offering both the structure and the kind of the experience, but the experience is done through the app, right? So it becomes this kind of total design from the kind of the volume to the animated surface. Because I think one really interesting value of the project is the desire for the animated surface in the city, right? But not only as part of a billboard, but also as part of the architecture itself, right? So that we kind of start making these kind of other movable or more kinetic structures. But I do think it's an interesting question to, like, what is behind it? Like, is that just an existing building, or did you design a new totally blank volume, and how would that look like? What would that entail, right?
Yeah, right.
Maybe just one in relation to the kind of user-based app, in thinking about like a user-centered idea of the project. I don't know. I feel like perhaps that's been explored. I'd be curious, and perhaps this could be a bad thing. What would be like a building-centered idea of AR in a quite literal one, in terms of like, you know, are there certain ways in which the building outfaces to a certain group of people versus another group of people? And then hopefully through that conversation, you could spark a dialogue that I think would open up, yeah, just like ideas of control and whether those things should be available to everybody or not. Because right now, I mean, if you go through Google Street View, there's a whole set of sites that have been completely blurred out for a numerous amount of reasons, right? So it's already kind of happening within a particular way. And I think this is just a very relevant conversation, and AR seems to be a good way of exploring it.
Yeah, I also think, I mean, only to reiterate, I think that you can address the same issue, not necessarily being as personal or as political, but I do think that there's a criteria missing as to what guides your intervention. And so that intervention doesn't need to be about Black Lives Matter, as I suggested, but like it can be about anything that you wanted to make it about. Even if it's in architectural terms, I think that the focus isn't very clear. And so like transforming a sort of generic new kind of construction of apartment buildings and transforming it formally simply for the sake of form, I think that in the long run and in the context of thesis, you're going to run out of gas fairly quickly. Whereas if you sort of bring in social norms or you know, cultural patterns or behavioral trends or you know, types of users in the area, I think that if you bring in something that guides how those interventions are planned out or thought of, I think that it'll be a more interesting conversation and it'll be a more interesting investigation for you to do, because you'll sort of bounce back between your intervention and the data, or the intervention and the cultural trend, and so and sort of bounce off, and you'll sort of become, your process will become more clear and more complex, which will make your project richer.
Yeah, we have 3 more minutes, so
Well,
I'm not letting you go before we do.
No, I mean, I would just add, I mean, but I also wonder whether or not, sometimes this is a good point to also figure out what's at like the heart of the student interest, right? So I wonder whether or not there is a very specific formal project that you are interested in, that is maybe less indeterminate and more and less about other kinds of inputs and more about some sort of system of a, you know, a super pixel building facade that produces an interior that is very specific. Like I wonder, I can't tell, because I wonder, Kisi too, like in your guys' kind of conversations, if there is a sort of building that he's trying to design, or a full or a kind of system. And there seems like from your responses, Kai, that there may be actually a building that you're after to design. So I'm also sensitive to that at this moment at a thesis project.
Yeah. Okay. So if there are no more comments, we can go to the next project. Yeah. Okay, thanks everyone. Let's go to the next one.
Thank you everyone.
So I think that's me. Hi everyone, my name is Yifan Wang. So yeah, my thesis is talking about the emotional garden world. This is an aesthetic exercise of disciplinary program. showing the virtual garden world, trying to define the new habitat of nature and the post-nature and the systematic landscape that contains within its flora and biosynthetics. By creating the flora which evolve not out of the aesthetic reference of the human, but out of the inertial logic of the new code, the thesis is replacing the process of the human aesthetic selection with new thinking. Our work is by scanning and modeling for the things such as some kind of organic creatures and other elements of the nature, using a variety of the programming languages to create a series of special structures, geometrical languages, or the machine principles, or processing pathways, animation, something like that. We can explore the connection between them and our emotional experience, our emotional exercise. And this will be used as a tool library to compose the design. The project attempts to create a new social mode in which different users can experience a virtual world using the virtual reality that reflects the emotions of the different people who use this kind of the software or things. And then this world are composed of many groups of the layers, such as the landscapes, the boundaries, rocks, different size of the plants, and then using the program languages and visual effects technique to describe the unnatural changing world. That's even the host the emotions changed. We can to see how this animation or the geometry change to show clear to show the world change. And through the study of the theory of the emotion classification, several immersive experience in the world of the different kind of the things that happened in these things. And then in the future of the thesis time, I will I'll keep going on design and then test all these different main plans, how to change in the different emotion classification of the world, and how they to showing people that they can feel the host emotions are changing or in a different time beyond the normal way. So this video is basically kind of the simulation of what people can see in the virtual world. To basically, this is a demo test, and then all the things will be animated, include the geometry and also the textures. Yeah, I think it's it.
Sorry, Yifan, can you just clarify again where this is located, or I couldn't hear you correctly. Which ward?
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I mean, this is a kind of the virtual garden world that is not located anywhere, but is totally virtual, that people can get into virtual reality to see what the host emotional classification showing which kind of the word, I think.
So would your goal be to have by September a sort of installation of an immersion into this virtual world?
Yeah, by the study of the emotion classification, I mean the simple one, it will be anger, fear, pleasure, love, sad, surprise, some kind of the emotion like that. So basically, in the future, I will create these several words about the main landscape and then the main plants. Maybe they are not changed so much, but they can change in animation or the geometry. No, it's not like that, but I'm talking the geometry can change into between different words, so they so people can feel what's the things going on. So this is what I'm trying to do.
Yifan, how is that measured? How do you, this idea of the emotions, fear, the simple ones you described, fear, anger, stress, love, how are those what is that choreography? How is that measured? Is that an idea that that's a measured condition in the space, or is that a sort of, is there another way of translating that or working through that? That seems to be the very powerful kind of, I mean, this is really beautiful what you've started to produce.
Yeah, okay.
But I'm
What?
curious on process in that sense.
I didn't put the animations here because I want to show this world just like the full plants and then like the normal way. And then I did start to did some part of the animation, which, for example, you can see the big structure of the plants. And then one of the animations is that they just begin to break and then into many small pieces and then just disappeared. And that's when I want to use in the side emotion. Sounds like that. The other animation is that's one is to change the geometry outside, and then the other animation I can did some test for is to use the particle system and then also to change the texture animation to show that's how the emotion changed to the other one.
I really love this kind of idea of like a shared virtual experience where contemplation is the primary mode of address in a way. So, you know, however you're kind of representing the kind of emotive response through a garden, it seems to have a very kind of therapeutical connotation attached to it. And I don't think like models like these exist, and you know, it's quite stunning. And I would love to see a kind of real-time interface between perhaps like a different sets of people depending on their mood, and then how you extract that data could also be a part of the project. And you know, where's that data coming from, and how are you feeding it, and how is the kind of landscape reverberating or changing?
I think it's a really,
like,
go ahead, sorry. It's too much.
No, sorry, very, very short. Now, I really like the conversation that is going on here between natural nature and artificial nature. I think some of those objects, they are more recognizable in a way, like what we're seeing right there. It looks like some sea plants or something like that, and some others are almost crystals. So I like that they sort of belong to different worlds, different sort of natures. And I also really like the sort of drama that is happening here, that some of those, they look like they are growing and that they're healthy, let's say, like alive, and some others, they look like that one, it looks like very fixed, right? Like more like a stone or the crystals. I mean, some are growing and some are sort of getting destroyed, I would say. Like there was also some smoke at one point, or sort of explosions. So I think that that's sort of creating something that nature does, like creating the cycle, right, of like the seed that it explodes, it creates a plant, then it grows, and finally it dies. I think that sort of that biological cycle, it's happening here, and I think that's what nature is about. So that really works. I really would like to maybe see this cycle happening like lively, as they were just mentioning, sort of I don't know if it's like a real time interaction, or organizing better how you actually show like these different images from different points of views, to sort of show different states and different time, even if the image itself is still. And I think that also the landscape that you have behind, maybe that can also sort of get modified. It looks like a background a little bit, and I think that could also be part of your system, that it's, I don't know, emotion and alive, creating this different moments in nature. I think it can really grow as a project. Sorry, Enrique.
No, I only want to say a small comment. I think that I mean, working on a game engine is one of the most satisfying and frustrating things I've ever done. So, so I think that, I mean, there are several technical technical issues that you're going to run into
Okay.
that are all easy to overcome working appropriately. But I think one thing that might be helpful for you is to think of it slightly narratively. If you think of this as a world that exists in the same way that the world has its own sort of way of being and is sort of modus operandi, you can think of this world, you know, and the mechanics behind it. And so if you think of it in that way, you're creating a world that is fully realized in its fiction, and then you apply the way you want to experience this world as a second process. I'm only saying this because if you depend on building this world on the way in which you experience it, you might run into the same sort of dead end all the time. Whereas if you think of this world that, you know, if there's more hate or if there's more love or if there's more fear, it develops in a world, then you might start thinking of it spatially and developing this fictional world that is fully realized. And then when you think of how the person might experience a section or another, or it might regenerate to produce a different landscape, you'll already have a reference to follow that will already guide very much how the user will experience this. So think of this world like it exists and it has a way of being, and sort of set up your own rules for this world so that then when we're experiencing it, it feels real because it has a reasoning behind how it's composed.
I see.
What's happening? Is everyone still here? Yifan, did you want to say something?
No, I think I'm done the statement, and then yeah.
Which ones were your next steps? Like, how were you thinking about developing this further?
Next step, I will I'm already beginning on the other kind of the different landscape, which showing another emotion. So I will keep going maybe 2 or 3 at the same time, and then try different animation about all the geometry and the texture, how they changed, and how and what a point time they begin to change between the emotions changing. And then just like this word, I will create another and then another, and then keep going to more how to say, yeah, because you can see the many plants here is not moving, but I already did some tests for the this animation things, so I will fix that first, and also, like you said, make a kind of narrative change, and then thinking how these things can change smooth and make more sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think Enrique's comment is really good for you. And you know, it's something we talked about before in some ways about like looking at Ian Chang's work and his kind of relational graphs for understanding the kind of the interrelations and the structures that kind of undermine how the world kind of operates or performs, like whether it's a linear narrative or it's just more of a kind of narrative about how the world exists through these kind of relational structures. I think like maybe before, now that you have this thing out there, so as you've been kind of working very locally on like, you know, specific aesthetics and features of this thing, I think, you know, this is something that we've been talking about for a while, but we haven't really seen yet. I think kind of producing this basically like, you know, it's not a storyboard because it's not linear, right? But it's this underlying kind of world network, like kind of diagram for you about how the different things are related to each other, how they operate, how they change over time. right? And like basically the kind of structural map for how the world operates as a more informal diagram, I think would be super helpful, because otherwise I feel like you're going to kind of spin your wheels refining details that maybe aren't super consequential for the different experiences. So I think having like a roadmap would be the first thing that would be good to develop here.
Okay.
That looks great.
Yeah, it's really great. I think one thing for me would be that I think what you're following is more a Japanese mode of world building, you know, than like a Western one, which has to do more with like environmental storytelling and things that are implied rather than things that are explicitly done through the narrative, right? So I think to explore some other modalities of engagement, like world tendency, you know, other modes of rendering, some kind of atmospheric change that happens, you know, like in the FromSoft games, you always have this like change from one domain into another, and everything, like the entire field changes because they you know, they kind of take care about every single detail. So I think right now, though, I think you're in the very much still in the default mode in many ways, right? The game engine look is still very much like very strong, I would say. And I think to kind of, I think Jeff mentioned this idea of like therapeutic experience, which I think is very close to some of these topics. Like, I think you should probably design these through multiple scales, everything from textures to particle systems to atmospheres to entire like day and night cycles becomes part of that experience. And once you traverse the space, it's kind of, you know, it's growing on you rather than like pointing like explicitly, like in Assassin's Creed, right? There is like everything in the world has like its own icon. I think your worlds are more subtle, you know, much like some of the Japanese references I think you're drawing from. So, but then even after this, I think there's a question for me of like, how do we translate that into an architectural proposition, which I think this is an architectural proposition, but how do you make that legible to the audience, right? How do you make sure that people understand that the construction methods you're using and the thinking about space are deeply architectural, and they're not just there to kind of reinforce the cliches about, you know, games and kind of these kind of experiences that are of interest to you, right? Which I think one of the points of maybe today's review will be to see how we can transcend the individual, even though individual politics are incredibly important, right? But how can we transcend the individual into some kind of collective value through these kind of projects, right?
I think that's a very important question for this project in particular. And I wonder about I also really like the comment, Damian, about being, in some ways, it feels a little bit like you're kind of developing things in a sort of intense but even manner, like, and so what are like the idea of, you know, day cycles or things that are like deciding when you're going to go very small or shift the way in which you think about how to design, where do you start? I mean, these are actually very architectural questions, right? Where do you start? How do you set up the scope? I mean, this is maybe banal, but I think that this is maybe important here. But I do think that I made a comment about the species, the idea of speciation in the project seems to be generative, like you're generating, you know, life form or synthetic nature form, and that's where I wonder whether or not I think that the idea of the emotions can maybe help you as a kind of internal metric. I don't think that it's particularly like discursive necessarily until you maybe start to move it from ideas of like these very basic and generic emotions to maybe categories of aesthetics or categories of species. So I think that it's a really appropriate place to start, but I would challenge you to think about how to communicate that out in a way that that is not quite so subjective and personal, I mean, and also generic, right?
Great. Okay, so this is, we are on 20 minutes. This is perfect. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. I will think more about that.
So, let's have the next project.
Hi, my name is Leo. I'm going to be the first project. Oops. So is the pop futurism. Sorry, I think. My topic is pop futurism. The goal actually I was gathering the all the pictures from the social media about the internet. Then, I'm not sure it's loading correctly. Sorry, can everyone see the videos?
Yes, but your sound is a little bit glitching out, I think, for me at least.
Yeah, for me too.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Yeah, so as you can see, all the images over here are generated with the Stelgan, which is an AI platform that can actually collecting all the features from the what's the futurism social media, and then generate what the common features from the internet. By collecting those features, shoot, I don't think it's popping out correctly. Yep. And here are some example images of how the features was reflected from images over here. And by understanding all these features, I start to generate my own models by picking some of the most intriguing images, and then by adding features into them. This way, I basically collect some of the topics, like the suspended buildings, how the transportation and the buildings are actually in the opposite relationship. The building was hanging underneath the transportation system. And then there's like disproportionate buildings, which the buildings are extremely disproportionate based on our normal understandings. And then there are distorted buildings. The buildings are extremely alienated from our daily model, because that's how you perceive from the futurism on the social media. Here is the supported building, which how the building was supported the transportation from above. And by having all these features, I start to having the distorted city with grounded transportation. This start to form differently than the normal, than the regular behavior. Here is, I think the video are loading properly. And then in the end, I start to generate like the what's the AI city would look like, and how the city would, by combining all the features together, the city will have its own the city start having its own features combining together. Like this city will not just be the futuristic city, but with combining all the common features from the social medias and together. I think the Yep, that's it. Sorry, I think the video is the video loading is a slight problem. It's not really fluent.
I really like the way you argue for this project. I think it's very clear. I think this idea that pushing the sort of, I mean, if I understand you correctly, which I think you do, this a sort of taking all some large data set of social media images of the city and putting them together to sort of produce a new vision for what social media would really want somehow, like this kind of fiction of like throwing those things together to generate this new thing. I think that this is, I think that it's set up with I think that I find it kind of charming. I also think the kind of forms of visualization are a little bit new to my eyes in a way. Like I think that the kind of painterly towards the pop and kind of these kind of color soaked, that when it's kind of color, looks like color soaked kind of images of a model seem kind of interesting. So I mean, I think that if from a setup standpoint, I think you have communicated quite clearly. I wonder whether or not at that point, so are you going to be, is it about producing a kind of a multiple sort of constant hybrid spaces of the city, or is there now a sort of design of a future city in this case? You know, are you going to be moving towards a like a deeper, kind of more detailed? What are the implications? What are the consequences? Therefore, like what are the spatial and urban consequences of this? Or is it about a sort of kind of many things constantly in flux? I mean, it seems like you're moving towards an idea about the consequences of some of these conditions. I believe, and I think that would be quite important.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's also a question.
Yeah. So basically, it was about working towards how to reasonable, how to make the online. We'll see the glimpse from the social network, how people were understanding the futurism. But right now, by using this, I will producing like a master plans, expose those features and use them to reconstruct the idea of the city from the social media. So basically, it's like idea of collecting and then understanding and then making them reasonable for the people to understand what's a city actually can functionalize and can work as a real city.
I agree with Mira in that it's quite clear. It's also a very kind of explicit nod to pop art, and even like Richard and Terry Hamilton's poster, very famous poster in the 50s. It's just what makes today's home so different, so appealing. And it's a collage that was done by a collective or two UK artists looking at America and thinking about what's exciting about canned orange juice and TV dinners and the cinema. And they did this earnestly, and that was something that they did find quite interesting at that time. So like the idea of collaging imagery pulled from social media is like, I think really kind of imbued in that idea of pop art already. What I think would be kind of interesting is a way to expand on that. Two things. One would be specific location. So at the time pop art, it was, you know, the UK looking at America and this kind of idea of like vacuum cleaners and washing machines and this kind of new future of life. And thinking about that in relation to today and how certain kind of subsets of the world view other subsets of the world. And perhaps that could paint a particular picture, which I think you're probably already doing through that populated image of like, you know, your social media grid, like where you're kind of overlaying sets of images. But I think that would generate kind of different types of cities like you're showing here. And then the second thing would just be, you know, perhaps zooming in on a location just to get perhaps like a kind of one-to-one feel of what that space feels like. You know, what's really fascinating about that poster is like you get an intimate portrayal of an interior, and the way that you know, artists in the UK, specifically on that show in the 50s, were thinking about how people lived and thought of the world in the near future.
Yeah. About the specific location, what I'm thinking is when we're gathering the information from online, people normally like have a general concept about what the futurism is. It's like a brand hope for the future and very criticized of the modern days. And that I think is how the city was expanding all over the world. In that case, I think in the broad social media view, what the futurism city is actually everywhere, how the urbanism is occupying the space, like just like how the idea of futurism occupying the social media is like not based on a general location, but based on a broad idea what the city is. But yeah, I agree how it should have a more specific location with that.
I mean, I think that's like a really interesting inversion. You know, like all the precedents that you looked at were like as terms of like other futurist projective movements were things like emanating from an extremely local position and then creating like a generalizable future, like trying to take, like in the case of the Afrofuturism example we were showing, like taking like very specific like local innovation or transformation and then proposing a kind of universal project from that. This seems like it could be the inverse in a way. Like you're taking, it's not universal, but it's like basically everyone that has the internet and is interested in producing content about what the, you know, the future would look like, but then like reprojecting it back into the local seems like kind of an inversion of the typical futurist project, which might be like a really interesting way to give specificity to this thing as you're moving to the next phase where you're actually starting to design out this master plan and its consequences.
Yeah, like one aspect of the futurism, historically, I think it was to this ability that they had to extrapolate from the given conditions into a new image of society, right? Into somehow proposing a new, something that becomes a coherent new image of like the coming society or something, right? So what I think is happening here, if you just look at the labor process behind the actual project, I think something else is happening here, right? Because right now, what we have is a technical procedure that can produce an immense amount of imagery, basically, right? And then I think the designer position that is here is that what we can do is we can go through this almost as a tourist or some kind of like romantic painters, right? And then we can just extract or kind of recognize, you know, features that look like buildings or look like something, right? From that immense amount of image information, like in this image, for example. And then that this becomes kind of a role of the designer, right? To be able to actually interpret or divine the future, you know, like in the Middle East, they have this like drinking coffee, and then once you drink the coffee, there is like a layer of coffee left. And then basically you're, based on those, you look into it and based on the plots and things, you're predicting what's going to happen in the future. I think this is a version of that divination approach, right? Like looking into the machine learning imagery and then divining like, oh, this looks like architecture. Let me try to construct that. And I'm not saying that in a disparaging manner. I think it's an interesting approach, actually. It's because it's the one that tries to bring humanity or some idea of human intelligence, which is based on analogical thinking, right? Which is based on this idea of like saying this is like that, right? And I think this has a lot to do with this question of what an architect or what a designer can do in this new world, and the fact that she's just using that as almost just a very, very natural approach is super interesting to me, right? So I'm not criticizing the fact that the buildings or the geometries don't look almost exactly or almost nothing like the images. I think that's an interesting point to me.
Yeah, but I fully agree. No, go ahead. Sorry, I thought you finished.
No, sorry, I was finished.
Sorry.
Just go for it.
No, I was actually gonna say that I fully agree with that point, because I think that actually the images that you pick to start are fairly complex and fairly detailed as images, but then you do this sort of pop process that I also like the fact that you are talking about pop and I find it in two ways, the explanation of it, like pop in the sense that all this future is created by populating with popular inputs, let's say, because you're grabbing these images from social media. So in a way, social media and everybody is democratically creating this future. And also I think pop, by the use of the colors, it becomes a tool to like reduce the noise or the amount of detail of these images and creating this much more simple models that you create, but they have the color sort of like flattening them and killing part of that detail, and you use like really like I think it's 3 or 4 colors, like it's fairly simple, but then it becomes very complex again when you put all these sort of buildings or objects together again, and you create this future city that it's really complex again, because it has all like these different layers and different heights, and you were talking about the proportions too. So I think that A, B, A, B, A, B system that you are creating, it's very interesting. And the fact that actually at the very end, you are not even using the color. Like you just have like these cities that are white again, monochromatic. It's like they've been, again, losing their detail again, the color detail that we're seeing exactly right now. I do wonder what would happen if the city, when it becomes a whole made of these different parts, still has the color as it does in these virtual images, still in the model, and how maybe does that translate into some kind of materiality or not when we go to the model, or even when we imagine that this city is actually real. But I really like the process that you're creating here. I think it's interesting.
Thank you.
The other thread, I'm not going to be able to sort of, I don't think I'm going to give all enough references and stuff, but I think that, you know, another thing that's happening as a sort of pattern in the way that you are intuiting how to make decisions and seeing in the coffee ground, so to speak, is, you know, the sort of stitching together of infrastructures and buildings and landscapes, right? When you put the images together, the sort of autonomy of one thing and another, like lot lines, air rights, all those things disappear. The sort of individual parts that economized, like that make up the, like, let's say, economy of building in a city, in most cities in the world, it begins to dissolve. And so those borders, even financial borders, are being challenged here. And so this is right. This is like the 3-dimensional city, right? The 3-dimensional city, which would require a different kind of cooperative or collective for planning and building than one that is organized around a sort of grid that things, you know, move up, and then maybe the city then has, rights to be able to produce infrastructures that go through it. But it seems as if the idea of the infrastructure, which has control, has kind of horizontal control, like urban infrastructures can bob and weave in ways that, let's say, you know, privately owned building lots can't, right? And it seems like you are arguing for a sort of a way of of working on a sort of socialist like model for how a city would be developed as deeply interwoven as a kind of infrastructure, right? The city as an infrastructure rather than the city as a collection of privately owned entities. And so I'm sure there are quite a bit of like reference there. I don't really know them, but it seems like it would, that is also a part of the kind of question of consequence, right? Like this kind of future that you are sensing is sort of in need, right? I think that there's a sort of politic invested in the aesthetic choices, in just that sort of threading between the vertical and the horizontal, the strips, you know, that kind of interweave, that is also kind of latent.
Great. Okay, so if there are any more comments, or we can just go to the next student, if anyone has the last comment. Yeah. So, okay, thanks everyone. So we are going into the second group, which is some of my students will present, and starting with Philip, and then please everyone just have like 20 minutes in your mind when presenting, because what you really want is to have a conversation, and keep it below 5 minutes if possible. And I just want to preface everything by saying that in my kind of group, we are mostly working on this idea of relationship between kind of technological platforms and kind of personal expression, and how these two come together to produce maybe a personal platform, you know, and personal platform politics and things like that. So there will be things around making software, or making kind of design software for exploring these themes, and there will be other ways of dealing with that. And the relationship between the projects and architecture is, I think, what is really at stake at this point in time. So how do these things like come together, and how do they produce maybe like questions or some trajectories? Okay, Phil, you can start.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to share my screen, but I'll also put a link in the chat to the video and a Miro board I've been using to work from. And okay. So my pursuit is to combine the communication abilities of software like Zoom with the creation methods of video games like Minecraft and Fortnite. Cohen created a platform that will meet and exceed sort of the collaborative design abilities of the real world through software. So today I present to you a multiplayer video game based around placing different architectural objects in a series of serene natural landscapes. To accomplish that, I've dipped my toes into past projects and precedents around designers like Hal Drucker Co., creating virtual spaces and bubbles in urban environments, like a sort of a oasis to the desert of reality. Also, ArchiZoom's No Stop City, creating a platform for others to design instead of just creating the design yourself, or Micromega's, a series of drawings that twist a two-dimensional image into a vast three-dimensional space for the viewer to get lost in. The aspects vary from the art of drawing and representation to the Cartesian plane and creating form or shapes with found objects. However, I would like to focus today's discussion on the idea of scale and perspective. Most of the modeling and drawings architects focus on are based around units, feet, meters, numbers that represent sort of the size, shape, and orientation, and rarely do we interpret our designs through our scale, the human scale. On the frontier, you act as a character, a person building and creating mass and space like games such as Fortnite and Minecraft. The character one is playing as or is acting through the scale at which we view things in virtual space. They become the units we base all of the sizes and distances from. Very much like the Cartesian plane used in most modeling softwares, but now there's another form of drawing, sort of the act of representation, but instead of through the pen, it's through the character the first-person camera we view and control through our screen or monitor. However, it's different from just viewing a movie, rendering our image. The interaction creates a world with each player's unique experiences. The perspective is no longer a single predetermined path. It's something that we can control, even though it requires a bit of imagination by putting yourself into the character's shoes to experience this world directly as you create it. The first-person video game allows us to translate the scale and perspective and immersion into a scale that we know and experience every day in real life. So putting yourself into the character's shoes to design and build around you, while mentally trying to break the bonds and restraints of the translation through the 2D monitor or screen. Ever since Doom came out in 1993, we've been trying to create and explore virtual 3D space around us. And for the last few decades, architecture has been testing different ways of designing with technology through the Cartesian plane of modeling softwares like Rhino. It's time to sort of take ourselves into the void of virtual space and encode the human perspective into our modeling and designing software at the core. This video is a sort of demonstration of the gameplay, where you're at the moment. It's just a small demo, so there's just one world, this sort of grassland, as well as just one series of architectural elements based off of many of Mises buildings and sort of the Misesian style of corners and details. And then you're able to control and place these different objects in this immersive 3D world.
So, Phil, did you finish your talk?
Or? Oh yeah, I finished. Yes, if anyone has any questions or anything.
Could you bring up your Miro board?
Yes, I can.
If you think that's helpful, or you want to. Yeah,
somewhat. So this is it kind of lays out sort of the plan of all of the finer details of the game, as well as what I'm hoping for it to look like in the future, like sort of menu aspects that add to a level of description, making it easily translatable, but also allowing you to kind of have control over your modeling, placement of objects, and alteration of such, as well as some screenshots of just demonstrations and things I've created in the game. And then precedents and other aspects and details.
Will there be sound?
At the moment, I do not have sound, but would be
I'm
interested.
wondering about that, like this idea of the first person unit as a sort of form of a metric, right? Mm-hmm. And so what other kinds of elements come into play? And sound seems, I mean, obviously the taste and touch can't necessarily, mm-hmm. but there's like other things, other cognitive things that would maybe produce kind of a certain degree of noise in the experience that would kind of add to this as a generative space.
Okay, yeah, add to the sort of immersion aspect of the environment and surroundings.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess also like maybe a question is the kind of right now, like you said, and this looks like a tremendous amount of work you've done right now to get this going, but the kind of idea of, do we start, is it the idea that it starts kind of empty and then it gets populated and you populate it, or does it start full and then you are moving things around? Or are there different ways in which you can start what the, like set up what the default is? Default full, default empty, default, you know what I mean? Loud, default, you know, yeah, these are kinds of things that I wonder, you know, just like you can set your default in Rhino. So like starting to think about what those conditions are.
Mm-hmm. What I'm currently thinking about is the possibility of having it as empty, and then you're given a selection of random objects, so that if you approach this again or restart, you would end up having different objects, or a different landscape or location you're at, and then you would be the one populating it, as either by yourself or with someone else. So that if also you played with someone else, you would then have a range of more objects and collaboration in order to integrate, to create.
Yeah, I would question that, but I think that's.
Okay.
So if I'm thinking of certain games that kind of operate on this level, have you played No Man's Sky?
Yes.
So
Very long time ago.
Very similar feel, right? In which you're kind of on an open world, and you've been given a set of predetermined building libraries in which you're drawing from, right? And that world is shared, and they have particular environments, or there's atmospheres, and that also determines how and where you're deciding to build things. I guess for me, perhaps thinking about this on like a smaller scale, like what could those building libraries be? Do they need to be kind of predetermined? Right now you have a kind of very structured Bayesian set of blocks that you're picking and choosing from. I guess, like, have you thought about the kind of building language in which you're using, and is that open for adjustment?
I think at least what I was starting with was trying to create a sort of library of different styles, kind of adopted or interpreted from architecture and throughout kind of sort of more recent ages. But I do think there is there's the possibility of creating new forms, but I'm not quite sure what that is yet exactly.
Phil, like I think like along those lines, maybe like one way to think about this, or at least an example of someone who's kind of working in this territory already that's thinking about this. This is very reminiscent of like the work that Jose has been doing, Jose Sanchez, over the last like 6-7 years or so, like down to the kind of first person exclusive perspective of building something up in the game engine. And then particularly like as it evolved, as he had to start teaching comprehensive studios at USC, so he was applying it to tectonic things that look like you do. And the projects kind of have that same look. But like where his project started to move in terms of this idea of what the collection of libraries was, is the thing he's like working on now is building a platform that's more about how people can basically like generate and share like an online collection of tectonic elements or details or things. So it's on the one hand, it's like a first person modeling platform, although like his platform also has moved exclusively from the first person because of the certain limitations from that, which you're still interested in exploring as a kind of generative design tool. But also this idea that this idea of the open source, especially if you kind of move into the construction, is basically the platform has become a library for people to upload innovations and details and constructs that then other users can sample from. Right, so like it basically would mean that for you as a kind of platform developer, like the constraints you put into it lead to certain types of designs, but maybe one thing you open up is that the multitude of users can begin to create a library for you of potential construction details or potential tectonic elements, right, that can be sampled together. And that starts to take it into also like a, I mean, that's like one very specific, obviously Jose is very specific in his interest on the idea of the commons and kind of open source software, but also open source architecture as a kind of political and economic model. And like maybe you should think a little bit about like what your kind of economic model is for the production of this architecture, and that might lead you to kind of like maybe the same or an alternative solution about how to source kind of architectural materials.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, that's I guess one of the reasons why I was thinking about No Man's Sky, because inevitably it generates a very uniform built landscape. So thinking about the kind of democratic approach to constructing a library in which everybody's drawing on, I could see have a ton of potential and pretty inconceivable results. So yeah, I would just think about how you make that library open source and available, and thinking about it less as a kind of hands top-down approach and like you're authoring everything and kind of making the library available, to like thinking about what the potential is of what your next door neighbor thinks of architecture and what they're building, and how that starts to kind of add and compete, and also just become sampled and aggregated together.
Okay.
One of the things that I find super interesting about game engines is the fact that because they can look like natural landscapes and the elements that we put in look as recognizable items, we begin thinking of them as we would in real life. But the reality is that the generative foliage that you use to make the landscape and the detail when you zoom up close is actually just as equal in terms of component wise, in terms of what the components are, as these architectural elements. So potentially, if we think about it that way, we can start thinking of an architecture that it can be incredibly pragmatic for us to think of space and very like architecture centric, or we can begin thinking of new elements to bring in that define what this architecture is. And so in that way, we can bring in all kinds of elements. We can, I think that it's more about how we can alter what we conventionally know as this building process and hijack it because you're using it in a virtual environment now. And I think that even though it can ultimately be a very didactic and specific and precise tool for building architecture, I think that the process to get there might benefit from going a little outside the line for a little while.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, these are awesome points. Thanks, Evan.
I mean, I wonder about like the way in which like when you are making these kinds of choices and decisions, I think fundamentally it's a question of how you're designing the platform, right? What are the conditions of default? What is that? What are the deep structures here? That to me seems like probably the thrust of what you need to be doing. And so how do you make those kinds of decisions would be, what are the outcomes of like setting up this as a default versus this as a default versus this as default, like whatever those things are. And so I wonder if you can be thinking about what kind of world condition you want, what kind of range of world conditions you want to be able to support, or experience you want to be able to support by this platform seems really important. Like to me, one question, and maybe this is, I think maybe through a kind of a thread that others are picking up on, is that is this about right now? And again, I really want to compliment the project right now. At this point, though, that there is a sort of sense of stability. Like this is about a sort of process of reinscribing a certain degree of stability in what the output. And I would question that. Like, what are the things that are actually active in this platform for design working that maybe would produce some degree of instability, randomness, chaos. Is there like You know, are there I don't know, like that to me seems, you know, like the stability coming out of like the parts are kind of recognizable. They're kind of like this modernist tropes. Like there's a sort of like vanilla kind of through line, visual vanilla-ness, which you should know.
That's a great expression. Thanks, Mira. This is awesome.
Yeah. I feel like there's sort of that barrier. Well, there's kind of a line between sort of accessibility and sort of pushing boundaries. And I think so far I've taken it very much in the accessible route, to where it's very limited and constrained.
Weird shit, right?
But then it's how can I kind of push this to break some of the limits and constraints of the player or user base, but also making it understandable, controllable, and inspire the player to take those risks or make those design decisions.
I mean, this is your thesis. I think you should be as radical as you can possibly be. I mean, radical about producing a sort of frame of mind and a value set. So I think that whatever you think is, I hear a sort of conservative interest in being able to make it somehow user or whatever, but this is your thesis. Like you should be like, you know, like it should be like a radical, like maximal, like experience. Like you can dumb it down later when you try and get somebody to buy it, you know? I just don't think it's.
I understand. Okay.
Like if you ever lecture on your thesis in a year's time, say, let your lecture be about how revolutionary your ideas were, and then how pragmatic they were when you were able to dumb it down for the general public. If you had a lecture about how accessible an app is, I don't think that lecture would be as interesting or your work as powerful. So like venture to go that extra mile, because then making something user-friendly, it's not that it's easy, but I think that the catch and the power of your work is in taking it as further as you can.
Okay.
Yeah, one thing I would like to question or point out, I think it's super interesting. Somebody sort of mentioned this, the fact that when you were putting like that demo, it felt more like we were building this object than actually designing it, if you know what I mean. Like this fact that you have this interior point of view, and you were comparing your software with Rhino, for example, that we are also like looking the object from outside, right, from the exterior. And you were mentioning in the beginning also that you need to sort of direction the fashion into scale and perspective. And I think those two words are key if you are talking about the point of view that you are using to design / build this object, right? It sort of makes me feel like the difference of physical modeling, like actually having parts and having to put them together, versus 3D printing a model that, I mean, you are more conscious of the process when you are with your hands, like making or building this model, that if you're actually just sort of pushing a button and then you just go and you grab your beautiful model and that's how it looks. Like, I think that the process here, it's key, right? Like you are grabbing these pieces, you're putting them together. And I don't know if you will have like the option of going like to have an exterior view while you are designing or putting together your building with these elements or parts to look how it's looking, or if there is sort of this like sort of surprise when you actually put finish or done, and then you are able to see how it looks from the outside, and maybe you didn't have that option while you were putting the building together. So I think that's super relevant. And regarding the open source library and all of that, yeah, in the beginning I was, well, am I able to actually design these elements like inside the software or not? Or it also got my attention, the fact that the elements, like a window is a window, a column is a column, a slab is a slab, like maybe they can be a little bit more generic, or you have the option of using more generic elements that can operate within like as different, different functions, more into the discreteness maybe world, that you can have like, I don't know, something that it's the same element, but that can work in different ways. Like maybe because you use right now like Mies objects, and they're also very identifiable. We exactly know that that's Mies column, and nobody will think about using that in a different way. But maybe that's part of the trick, putting these ideas on the table. I think you've done so much work until now that it's awesome. And I love also the way that you are really animating the context. Maybe there is also like a time factor that you started building in the morning and you're building and time is running and you see like how light is changing your building, like in the way real life happens. I don't know, just things I wanted to point out, but really going good.
Just, can I make one last comment?
Yeah.
Sorry. The kind of bland or like monotony associated with BIM, like building information modeling, or like the visual vanillaness.
Yeah. I didn't want to mention Revit, but there is something about
right. And that, and
yes.
so like that's that I think becomes the point of contention here, in which, you know, libraries are in a certain sense relegating our profession to, you know, a set of managerial decisions, right? And so by trying to challenge that and opening up the library in certain respect to like what Casey was mentioning, and I think what everybody's mentioning, you, I think, perhaps regained a little bit more control, or regained a level of authorship in architecture that is starting to, I think, fall to the wayside.
Okay. Yeah. I
So
think that's a
that-
constant challenge. It's how do you model something with a software without having that specific software like ingrained in the final result.
Yeah, so this is great, and I think I don't want to be a policeman. I just we need to go to the next one, because, or Casey, if you have like a very quick point.
It's really quick. You know, like right now you're using the in the first person design software, right? Like you're using kind of an orthogonal orientation of your parts to maintain an order as you're assembling them, right? Like they kind of snap together, which is where the kind of Revit look comes from. I just want to like, do you remember, do you use, I mean, you've learned Maya at least a little bit, I know you have, but like, which is another, you have the ability to work from first person in that, and it has a camera-based way of like operating on content with the center square. And like when that came out, like I remember back in Graph when I was in the office, it was so detrimental to producing what we thought of as ordered architecture that we banned, like we saw an intern clicking on the center box in Maya to move relative to the camera plane, rather than using the 3 axis, like they would get chewed out. But I think this may be something for you to consider, as like when you destabilize the grid as the ordering principle, like what other ordering principles for your formal construction can you have? Because you're kind of still working within the grid, even though you're in the square person perspective.
Yeah, good point. Thank you very much.
I just want to say one thing now, because I think the main challenge is how do you go up in the project, right? And I think that's where Minecraft was so amazing. Minecraft is a genius, actually, software for design, because the world is the form, right, in and of itself. So while building the world, you're kind of going up, and you can kind of conquer the entire spectrum of possibilities. And I think in your case, we are still bound to this idea of the plane versus the something that holds something up, you know, this tectonic idea. So, and I think we're going to work on that, obviously, but so far I think it's great. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. So next we have Cameron, I think.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Cameron. So I'm also developing a modeling platform that challenges conventional modeling space by incorporating behaviors into the modeling workflow. And behaviors here are being defined as a scripted action that an agent in the platform has the option of taking. And by embedding behaviors into agents that live within the platform, the modeling space becomes a simulation of these behaviors that play out over time to generate content. The architect is no longer expected to master the software platform operations, as the platform now possesses a large share of the design agency over itself. So the architect is instead asked to take on the role of a cultivator or instigator. And so the platform currently has 4 agents at different stages of development that are shown here in this sort of mapping of interaction. And each agent is translated from a source of architectural narrative that also describes each agent's behavior, which are drawn from these 4 sources here at the moment. And these behaviors are translated into software scripts and then arranged into behavior trees that dictate which behavior an agent will take based on evaluating the current conditions of the other agents. And so what this leaves us with is a sort of self-contained, self-playing space of interaction between digital objects that serves as a generator of formal and aesthetic content, while simultaneously arguing in favor of behavior tree, or the idea of the behavior tree as a new paradigm for design methodology and sort of process. And so that's it. I'm currently working on further developing the actual interaction between the agents, in addition to the aesthetic possibilities of the platform.
Cameron, can you go back to can you repeat, like, again, like the tree, the behavior tree, like the kind of this thesis statement again, can you kind of repeat it for me?
Yeah, to simplify it, or not simplify it, but to put it sort of like plainly, the thesis idea is that that our modeling software can incorporate or just rather distribute agency to the objects in the platform in the form of behavior trees, and sort of relinquish some of our design agency to the platform itself in a more intricate way than sort of what we were just talking about, like Rhino and the parameters of Rhino or even Revit, to where we become part designer and part also observer or researcher of the platform.
Okay, and then can you go back and look at, until people start asking questions, can you kind of demonstrate again a little bit more?
So each of these objects in the simulation are an agent that contains a set of scripted behaviors that are translated from the sources. Like a lot of Bernard Tschumi's writings have been translated into behaviors. And then the idea is that this space of simulation is sort of continual, and that they'll just continue to interact and generate until someone decides to just turn it off.
Yeah, I think one of the themes, Cameron, you can also maybe talk a little bit about the references, right, and where the work situates itself in the contemporary kind of discourse around simulation, and simulations maybe becoming a new, or not so new anymore, but a novel way of kind of producing culture, or kind of even producing artwork, right? And this idea of embedding intentionality into objects and that kind of participate in the simulation versus that design intention or the intentionality always lied in the figure of the author, or someone who is actually like starting the process, right? Or what I think is really interesting here is that what you're working on is in many ways a version, at least to my mind, of like Tschumi's Manhattan transcripts, where instead of maybe translating from kind of a cinematic or you know, like a movie scenario into a graphical language. I think what we're dealing with now is this idea of mobilizing simulations and behaviors of objects within simulations as means of exploring what an architectural narrative or a special kind of way of drawing architecture can do, right, within the simulation. So I think this is really interesting, and maybe one of the main references for you was the work of Ian Chang and his kind of use of or not use, but the difference between the open-ended, chaotic, right, world of simulated agents and the narrative, or something that we can recognize as narrative, right? Where when the two clash, when these two realms clash, you don't really, the results are unexpected, right? And it's not clear how one maps onto the other in some ways. And so the question becomes, what happens to narrative when it's exposed to this new kind of regime of thought about this the artwork. Yeah.
Yeah, I think another way that I also have approached this is another sort of evolution in the physics simulation that a lot of us use to design, especially in Rhino and Grasshopper. So it's essentially like taking the sort of dropping objects mentality and building upon that to include specific actions that objects can take inside of that sort of environment.
Yeah, so what are those behaviors? What's your palette of behavior?
So it's for each agent, they have a couple of different behaviors. The one that's certainly or developed the most so far is the block from the Manhattan transcripts. And this is just my translation of Bernard Tschimi's text, where this agent can take on any of these 5 behaviors. So climb, slope, skate, and circle. And these are translated into, like, in terms of like the engine itself, the Unreal Engine sort of operations that can actually happen.
Where do you see this? Where do you see this platform and this world, this game, being? Where do you see this going in terms of its the context of the game? Like, is that like the White House that you have in there? What is the buildings that you have in there right now? Like, what is the ideal? Is this an open-ended game like the other, that you start with something empty and you bring stuff in, or is this a different kind of project? A project where you are actually deploying this in a sort of either abstract space or a simulated space that we know? Like, where do you see the consequences best sort of? Because I think that I think that this is super smart and interesting, and I'm curious, where do you see the work being best deployed in order to produce the strongest thesis?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question. I think I haven't been thinking of this as in the game sense, where you start with an empty platform and then you generate the content. It's been thought of as the content existing and sort of shifting over time.
That's what it looks like.
And so I'm not totally sure how to answer your second question yet, but I think yeah, I'm still like continuing to think about that in terms of like where it'll be like most volatile, I guess.
I mean, I'm thinking about, like, I'm thinking about contemporary things. I'm thinking about like the crisis of the monument right now. I'm thinking about other kinds of ways in which maybe your like the work can be like that you are actually arguing for a way to deploy it in a contemporary way. And I wonder about whether or not to deploy it is in a space of abstraction or is in a space of assumed kind of realism.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's, to me, is like right now it's in kind of a hybrid, or because it's the beginning. Yours is just the sort of the beginning of the apparatus, but I wonder whether or not you are going to need to, yeah, this is my question. I think it's clear, my question.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Yeah, it's currently it's only in this sort of abstract state, but I think it could be really interesting if it's deployed in something real and recognizable. And on top of that,
a moment of radical behavior. You know, so I just think that it could lend, the tech will be the tech. I think that it could lend and could be deployed the way you want to deploy it later, again, when you want to sell it. But like in terms of like generating a way of like giving it a sort of currency right now, I mean, I think that there's something very relevant. Yeah.
Hey, Karen, very interesting project. I have a question for you. So if the platform is trying to enhance the intentionality of the objects, so in other words, the modeling software is trying to give agency to each one of these objects to act independently, then what is that doing to the role of the architect? And how do you see yourself as the author creating this machine?
I think it's definitely taking away some of the agency over any sort of outcome on the architect's side, as well as broadening the definition of authorship. And it's been hard for me to answer that question because I always run into the issue of me being the translator of the narratives that I've selected. So in a way, I'm still the author of this platform and the author of, I guess, any outcome that it could generate. But I think further on down the line, I do want to take on that question of like removing a little bit or a pretty significant portion of authorship from the architect, or not authorship, but agency over the design, and then working in some way to decide like what is a good outcome versus a bad outcome, similar to that conversation we were having at the beginning of today.
Yeah, because for me, what I think that might be limiting is the fact that you're the one like setting like, okay, so I'm looking at I think you wrote something around how to climb this slope or skate around this, right? So those are things that you can throw out there, and you might have like some sort of predictable patterns or geometries that can be generated around the idea of how can you accomplish climbing something or skating around something. So I don't know if it might be useful to try to find ways into incorporating things that are like a little bit less predictable. So like if you think about like all the protests that been going on for social justice, those didn't start by people wanting to riot and loot stores. That they started with a purpose. And the point that I'm trying to make is that sometimes you start by giving the software a series of steps, but I think the end game should be how can you work so that the software itself is able to take that series of steps and then develop from them another idea, and then based on that new idea, it's generating other forms, because based on everything that you're doing, the forms that you are generating are very recognizable. It's nothing that is kind of like pushing the boundaries of what design could be, or a platform that you are inventing could generate, because pretty much like this is so fantastic that it's able to generate information and shapes that are beyond our times.
Maybe just to add a quick thing, I like the way that you're kind of rendering the input through a very like, you know, Manhattan Transcript-esque drawing, or like re-diagramming something. And, you know, I'm thinking about like using that process as a means to render something illegitimate, or like perhaps like the bastardization of monumentality even. There's probably a lot of conversation in which that process could be involved in, and that would start to dictate, you know, the source material or what you're sampling from and what you're deciding to kind of input. And then using that drawing and that diagram as a means to reconfigure whatever that input material is. So you get a kind of drawing, and then through that drawing, you have a set of directions or operations in which, you know, it goes through another step again. So like, you know, your middle line here is that second step, and then the output is the bottom line, and then your first line is just the input material. What that is, I don't know, but I could see that really, you know, starting to gain, I think, a level of, I think, just being in conversation with kind of contemporary aspects of, you know, our current culture.
Right. Yeah. So like feeding the platform back into itself, almost.
Yeah, I think because William was mentioning, like, or you were saying as an answer, if you are the owner or the creator of what the software creates because you created the software, I think that the software should in a way become bigger than yourself, bigger than the creator of the software or the one who put the rules. My own thesis it was one of the Edge programs, so it was more like a final project than a real thesis. But the name of it was the unexpected aspects of control. So I think that even if you are designing this and you are in control of it or designing the rules, there should be something that it's always unexpected even from you. Because you were talking in the beginning about agent behavior or design agency. So I think that agency factor, it's something that should be unexpected. And that's when all this, at least to me, becomes even more interesting. It's like the student becoming bigger than the professor, you know. In this case, the software should overcome yourself. And I think that would be like really, really interesting here, creating something completely new and unexpected.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow, that's great. Thank you, everyone. This is super, super useful. Just in terms of Cameron's project, I think it's worth mentioning that like most of the work so far was really in the background, kind of designing the systems that informed the project. And I think one of the things that we are discussing, and maybe let's continue further, is this idea of what happens to the library, and what kind of library do we have, and what is the agency, and what are these like recognizable objects, what kind of aesthetics. So far we had this like maximalist approach where everything was thought of as being like, oh, let's test what happens to abstraction within the regime of simulation, right? What happens to realism within the same problem? What happens when we mix between abstraction, realism, cartoons, and line work, all in the same kind of pictorial space? And this was more like an exploration of these things. So all of the objects you saw are not actually, they're not really meant to be meaningful in any way, right? They're mostly meant to kind of represent a type of certain object or a certain aesthetic. So, but I think like a major point will be what are the politics of that revolve around the project, and how does that become real? You know, how does that become recognizable and legible? And that has to do with also like making things explicit, making things legible, teasing out things from behind the scenes until they become actors on a stage almost, you know. This and the relationship between agents, agency, actors, all of this kind of thing, I mean, that is embedded in the project. I'm really excited about that. I think Cameron Cameron has like a really organized mind, and as you saw from the diagrams, like it's really rich with possibilities, and we just need to see how to focus that into the expression, I think. But it's really awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.
So and now for something completely different, not completely but kind of different, we have Julian's project, and he will talk about it.
Okay.
Very excited.
Hi, I'm Julian, or Julian. I'm going to basically share on 2 screens. So if I'm not looking, it's because I'm looking at the bigger screen. But first I'm going to start with sharing this Miro board that you guys can look through while I go. Okay. Okay, cool. All right, so I'm just gonna kind of run through the journey of my project pretty much. So basically the central aim of my thesis currently is to understand the contemporary conditions of creating a personalized aesthetic platform and experience. My thesis project began with asking the question, what is the future of the queer, oh, I'm sorry, okay, wait. I think people can't access this Miro board. Sorry, 1 second.
Yeah, we cannot access without requesting access. Sorry.
My bad.
Remember. But
no,
I think you're showing
fault.
it, so it's perfectly fine. Don't worry.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, I lost my chat window. Okay, let me know if that works. But yeah, I'll just proceed with what I have on the screen right now.
Also, just to say, we are 20 minutes behind the schedule, so
okay.
Which is very strange how this happened. I was looking into every detail, so I don't know. I'm sorry about that, but let's try to.
No, it's all good. Yeah, I'll proceed. Okay, so.
However, that works. So don't
that
worry.
worked. Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so to continue, my thesis project began in thesis preparation with asking the question, what is the future of the queer dance clubs during this age of isolation? And since that period, some of the key questions have now become, how can I as a designer combine both the personal and the digital to kind of create my own aesthetic or mode of expression? So kind of the result is a personal investigation into my interest as a designer combined with other disciplines like music production, graphic design, creative direction, to create a world where some of these questions can be explored further. So here you can kind of see some of the central questions. I think something that's also very important to the project is the kind of idea of the creation of the identity through kind of the digital platform, which I think is something that a lot of us can relate to who are on social media currently. So basically, yeah, these are kind of the central themes. I'm gonna just proceed to the next part. So basically kind of the end goal of the project will be to develop methods and experiential campaign to create a self-created audience experience of my own art and architecture. Some of the outcomes will be a music video that explores these concepts and other disciplines. So, I mean, this is gonna take some time to go through at your own leisure, but basically it started with a storyboard of the music video, and obviously just a deep dive into like references that I would be exploring. And so then was kind of the next part of the phase, which was the scene curation, which like I said, kind of through the process of doing the storyboarding for this video, I started to develop these different worlds that I wanted to create. And you'll see that a central theme is the dystopian like landscape and natural disasters, because I kind of relate to the current question of like the future of architecture. What really is it currently? I think that's a big question for everyone. So these are just kind of some of the curations that I developed. Yeah, you can just see some of them. And then another central theme that I wanted to explore was kind of like the different technologies that I have like at hand currently, with being in isolation, and some of it was the 3D scanning. There's been a few explorations I've done with the own personal. Something I mentioned, talked a lot about with John Cooper, was the idea of queer ephemera, which is kind of, it's the reading that we kind of touched on was kind of exploring where queer ephemera lives. And I think a lot of it kind of begins in the bedroom actually of like queer people. And it's never fully experienced consistently. It's more like these ephemera that happen sporadically. And so yeah, I'm just gonna show you some of the 3D scans. These are some like furniture spaces that I went through in upstate New York. Then I'm gonna just continue to the miniatures. Also, if anyone wants me to zoom in on something, let me know. But the miniature was just kind of, again, a time to explore some of the materiality that could kind of be used in these worlds. I intentionally wanted to print and create with textiles and human, quote unquote, human textures in combination with the very digital, interfaces and models I'll be using. So there's just a few zoom ins here. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get this printed, but these are just some renders of the model. Lastly was the scene development, which is the current phase I'm in. There's a few worlds that I've been developing. The glacier world, which is one of them, which you'll see in the storyboard. This combines just very architectural elements with the 3D scanning. Again, like the combination of the personal and the traditional digital. So that's something that you guys can go through as well. The volcano world is kind of happening as well. So yeah, I mean, it's really for me like an experience to really investigate these platforms. And then this is another scene that's been developing. So actually, if you're on the board and you click on this link, you'll be brought to the first pass I've done with the music. I hope the music plays, but I guess it's working. But yeah, so this is the first pass with the world. Thanks, Mira. And so yeah, these are just kind of some passes. Definitely still in development, still figuring all of it out, but I'm feeling more comfortable with the Unreal Engine and the camera setup. So yeah, so it'll just be a process of continuing to develop these worlds. And something that me and Damian have talked a lot about is the element of the project, which is the campaigning of getting all of this content and release like out in the world. And that's like another phase in the project. So as it develops, these will be things that will come up, and just kind of having fun with the different venues to kind of display the art is the prompt of the thesis. And that's currently where it's at. So that's it for me.
So awesome, Julian. So is the idea, when you're talking about releasing them into the public, is the idea that they would be released as like audio video scenes that would be Zoom backdrops that you can download and then dance to and like feel good?
I haven't even thought about that actually. I was thinking more about the conventional well, one primarily is like Instagram, like definitely the vignettes that I would like be posting, and like the campaign involving Instagram. But I do think in combining what I was exploring for thesis preparation, I think it would be cool to have the spaces be interactive where other people could go into them. That is like, for me, like the end goal of the thesis. So I think the thesis would hopefully be, I think Zoom could be a potential platform. And I think the goal is to kind of have the viewer feel as if they're in the world and participating in it. I'm not going to say that they're necessarily creating what's around them, but they're experiencing it. I think what you suggested, like the Zoom link, could be really cool. Again, I'm like really open to anything. It's kind of like developing as it comes, but the incorporation of that would be pretty cool.
So I think, Julian,
sorry.
Oh, sorry. I think, I mean, we've talked about our work before, and one of the things that that I think isn't well defined yet is the punchline or the running theme of what your work is about. I'll give you an example that I worked on. I found something that was a phenomena that would happen within the queer stratosphere that was fascinating and a little gritty, but that I used that as a way to sort of navigate more specific aspects of the queer narratives that then I put into my work. And so, for instance, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there were these gifting parties where people who weren't infected with HIV would gather in order to get the virus. And so so obviously that's, you know, twisted and weird, but also it reflects a lot on the specific demographic that we're talking about. It reflects on purpose and behavior, and you know, it reveals a set of circumstances that are that sort of leave you with ingredients to use into a narrative. So say that we're talking about COVID and like how queer men, queer women, queer people are interacting, whereas before they would interact at the dance club, what that works like, then maybe find existing situations of whether it's Zoom parties or whether it's, you know, people are meeting on Grindr or whatever the platform, and you know, screening for COVID before they, I don't know what the context is, but I think that like if you find those existing existing data or existing patterns that then you put into what this world is and what this music video is about. It doesn't need to be linear, it doesn't need to be specific, but I think that it'll inform in a way that's more powerful what this world is composed of and what is the world that you're creating. I think that if not, it sort of, you can rely a little bit too much on what feels like it fits, as opposed to something that's a little more precise and a little more poignant, which I think not only are you smart enough to do, but also you're incredibly aware of, you know, the context that we're in and how it's affecting us, and how the queer experience is altered because of it. So, you know, I urge you to find little threads. It doesn't need to be the grim gifting parties example, but like, I'm sure that there are scenarios that you've come across in like the past few months, and I've not researched them further in order to like come up with like the Fire Island situation where people are just like flocking to Fire Island and having like COVID doesn't exist parties, and sort of, or for instance, how the outdoor party situation has suddenly become the more attractive option because like COVID isn't as transmissible during if you're outdoors, which is also relative, and you know, so just like find a few threads that are relevant and pertinent to the theme that you're exploring, and instead of it leaving it as this feels right, like push in there, because I think that the story that you have to tell is very important and needs to be told with the awareness that I know you can bring.
Totally. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I think, yeah, the idea of just feeling it out, I think I need to get past that stage, because I think I've found the aesthetics that are working well for what I want to do. So yeah, I totally agree. I think like it's, yeah, just getting more specific. I also mentioned like the campaigning stuff, but something I'm interested is like, now it's very common with these kind of releases to have like animated video, the vertical video, the blank, I don't know, all this different like collateral, which I think could be a fun thing to look through. But yes, I don't want to kind of cheapen the real issue, which is like the very difficult situation of being in isolation when those kind of communal spaces are so important for that community. You know what I mean? I mean, you know what I mean.
Yeah, and also like there's if you look at people like Pussy Crew, Pussy Crew is one word and crew is spelled with a K, or people, or Jason E. Beyer. Jason E. Beyer just did a project with the Toma Finland Foundation where he did a sort of new world kind of porn, and it's not porn. I mean, it has graphic content, but it's mostly CG rendering of the scanning of different porn stars, and it's sort of in this like crazy post-human world, and so it's a sort of development of a concept of a type of queer experience that we're used to seeing a certain way, but sort of translated into a new realm. And so in this case, it's about porn and sort of, you know, masculine porn and male porn, but there's a myriad of ways in which you can take this, from gender identity to COVID parties to, you know, there's a ton of them. So I urge you to find the one that fits you. And I'll type in the references for you to look at later.
Thank you, yeah.
Wonderful.
Julian, is one...
So John, just to tell you, this is the last comment. We have to wrap up.
Okay.
You can just, you can go.
I'm just going to say the issue of resolution, the resolution at which the body appears, and the politics of resolution, and the inequalities implicit in the height or lowness of resolution in which the body appears. And that to me is just a very striking aspect of your sequences, is that the different entities occupy different parts of the resolution spectrum. And I just think that links into a very broad and important kind of concern with this kind of technical work. But yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Thanks everyone. This was great. We have another project from my studio, and then we go to Mira's project after this. It's Jishun and Minxue. I think they're ready to go. Yeah, let's go. Or maybe they're not ready. So in which case we can.
Sorry, wait a moment.
So you have to. We are running a bit late, so let's try to be on time. Oh, I hate this being a policeman. It's terrible.
It's okay, Damian.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're not going anywhere, so don't worry.
It's good. I was thinking like they will escape very soon.
No, don't worry.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I'll share the screen first. And okay. Click this. Okay, my thesis is the memory city. We've always kept a record of our lives through words, pictures, symbols, from tablets to books. But in the current, in this digitalized world, we usually preserved our memory in the Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. These records never fade and always accessible. When people die, this information will stay in the digital world forever. In this digital world, everyone has kept a personal trove of digital information. I think we need a place to preserve the memory. My idea is to build an online monumental space where people can visit or experience the digital legacy of the deceased, not only for the passed away people, but also for the alive people. This is the demo game of the Monument City.
So we will send you a link towards our mural so that you can check. We start from building our project diagram. We suggest our project is a game. So the game should be starting from select the location that you want to visit. So in our case, we first built Italy. And in this city, you should have a one-click generation button that you can generate from the library of the Italy architecture. So that will generate a city. And here's another layer of the game. So we need to get access to the real people's social media platform information. And we put that information as a part of our program. And we will also put NPC avatars to be the living people or creators inside the city that will be a little bit vivid. And the player is just a visitor in our city. We first designed some mock-up things so that you can see a little about our game structure. So it's like we have like 3 hierarchies. First, when you enter the game, you will visit the whole city scale, and then can you switch to the neighborhood scale, and then finally you can switch into the interior scale. In the interior scale, you can visit very personal information in this screen. This is for our next step for design the interiors. Yeah, for now we only have the global view, like the construction mode, and we are still on the way to do the zoom-in view, which is the neighborhood we call it, and also the interior one. So here's some of our work in progress screenshots. We tried different aesthetics and different kind of photographic aesthetics. So we hope in the end that we can not only build a game, but also kind of build a cultural thing. So we hope people can actually hold the city model in their hands if they can build one. So our idea is to send some to sell some model that you generated, and it's one and the only model in the world. Everyone can have very unique one. And here's some references we got. So here's how the program is working in the background. We cannot have a plate that you can choose what kind of building is next to each other, so that based on that we can generate a very beautiful city. I think that's it.
Just to, it's a little bit, maybe from the presentation, it's a little bit maybe difficult to understand what's at stake, right? And I think one way that the project started really was from this idea of creating a monument for the victims of COVID pandemic that started happening when we started working with the project in the previous semester in the thesis prep. And the idea was to really kind of create an online archive of mentions and of these kind of references to people, and then to kind of deploy that in this way by mixing it with Aldo Rossi's City of the Dead project, which is actually where all the objects come from, right? So it becomes this continuation of Aldo Rossi's project as a virtual kind of platform for producing a monument in another form, right? This was maybe the disciplinary idea behind the project. And what they're actively kind of trying to do here is to think of all the ways that this can be deployed as a cultural idea, right? So a website, kind of a playable game, some kind of a collection of assets and so forth. Even to the point of it becoming like a board game, which I believe they wanted to make that for this part. I don't know if this happened actually or not. So, but this was the idea behind that, to kind of revisit Aldo Rossi's City of the Dead project and see what this can do as a contemporary so thinking about the ongoing crisis, you know.
Mm-hmm.
One question, does this actually have to do, because in the beginning you were mentioning, I mean, the name of the project is, or thesis, is Memory City, and you were talking in the beginning about Facebook and social media and sort of what happens with that content after you die. Is that content sort of going to be part of this memorial city that you are proposing, or is the city the new content that you are actually creating and it's going to be there after you are not? Maybe I didn't understand, but I wanted to ask this.
Okay, so we were hoping to put every information that you already have on a social media platform, whatever you are dead or alive, and generate that into our city.
In which way?
Part of, yeah, it's like we talk about that we have 3 layers of the perspective. So we should have all the information being collected and present under the interior view when people go into the building itself, that you can see some very private personal information, like some photos or some just sentences that you said before, as a way to memorize some people.
Okay, so it's sort of in a way to regulate your virtual content. Like we are not yet putting that in our wheels, right? What it's going to happen with my Instagram account, what happens with the password that maybe only I know. I honestly don't know what is the situation with social media in those moments. But I feel that you are maybe proposing like a solution for that in a very friendly way with a very sensitive subject, right? It also made me think about Eisenman's Holocaust monument in Berlin. This idea of creating all these towers of different sizes, different proportions that you can navigate physically. Sorry? I thought somebody was saying something. That in Berlin, in that case, you can walk inside, and the idea is that you actually get lost and you felt the oppression and you don't know the way out, and etc. And in these cases, it's, I think, a positive or much more friendly way of suggesting maybe a similar idea of walking in between this, and you can actually go inside and with this that you were just mentioning of going inside the buildings, maybe that's sort of the virtual private property that you maybe invite some people to go in there or not. Feels like, yeah, like a virtual monument of people. I think it's a sensitive subject, but it can work.
Hey, I put in the thread another reference, the project that Common Accounts, Miles Gertler and Igor, forgetting his last name, they have an ongoing project. It was a thesis project, and then it's their own office project, and they're continuing it. It's on the kind of architecture of death. And I think that there's similar aesthetics and similar sort of some things to maybe kind of look at there. I wonder about scale and this idea, because I think is really powerful, is this idea that it would become, depending on how you zoom in, it would become the kind of intensiveness of like the kind that there's a, when you zoom out, it's very contained, right? But then when you move in, the kind of like the levels of like the ways in which you work can manipulate resolution, so that as you move in, you realize there's a higher and higher resolution to sort of understand kind of infinite, like the kind of quantity, a sense of quantity seems to be kind of quite important from a visual standpoint. Even when in popular colors, pop colors, I think that there is a sort of how to manage that sort of, and that's why I would reference Common Accounts projects, because I think that there is a sort of interesting turn of aesthetics of managing the sort of viscera of death and a sort of consumable notion at the same time, different than let's say the memorial, like Eisenman's memorial, which is about a sort of somber sort of quality. So I think that there is there's something there, I think, as a tactic, but I think that how to move into the viscera in nonetheless seems really important. And then I think also the specificity, like the idea that it's an open platform where many things can get collected. I think the question is, how do you start to collect? And even even ideas about rituals, like different cultures have different kinds of rituals around death, around honoring death, and that's the kind of there, and that would kind of produce like different kinds of like devices, like infrastructures, let's say, banners or things like. I wonder whether or not the vocabulary of the parts could start to get cross-cut with other culturally relevant like minor icons, or things that kind of participate in a sort of much broader vocabulary around death aesthetics, death ornament, stuff like this. Like you start with the Rossi, I think it's not sufficient. I think it needs to become more different. And I think that part of the process of building up the thesis is how do you move into that? And I think that that's where I do think that setting this up as some sort of like closed, like I think that the thesis as an idea and the thesis as a process is saying, I'm going to start by, I want to build up specificity. You don't have to, at the end, it may not have all the content. Like you said, it's going to be for everything. It's going to have everything. So the question is, how do you set up a system, or how do you begin to incorporate, fold in, like the everything, right? Like, how does that start? And I think those questions and those tactics are a thesis. And so I think that, and maybe that's also a way of kind of a more general comment of like, if the project doesn't go live on Instagram, or the project doesn't do all these, like that isn't a sort of failure. I think the question is, how do you, what are the things that are trying to, that are controlling the kind of question, like the value set here, seems as important as the sort of result as well when it comes to generating a discourse, which is what the thesis is, you know. Yeah.
So, so one reason for us to only choose Frothy, because we want to keep a very continuous aesthetic in a project. And in this case, also his idea about how people memorize the past is kind of close to ours. So yeah.
And also Elder Rossi is like the typology is like to summarize all of the people live city typology in his project. So we choose he as the representation in Italy.
Sorry, this might have been already said, but there's a lot of things that I admire about the project. The one thing that I'm questioning though is just the idea of a monument in the kind of current phase of the pandemic, insofar as this starts to read as like a colorized ongoing tally of the dead opposed to a kind of memorialization, right? We are still kind of in the thick of things. And then I find that maybe the kind of vibrancy of the project could start to undermine the kind of significance and meaningfulness of you know, people who have unfortunately perished. And I don't know, I think starting to pick up on some of the comments, integrating other forms of iconicity, I realize the kind of idea of continuity, the visual language, but I think that you would benefit from opening it up a little bit.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Okay, that was a grim topic delivered through a kind of a techniques of making cute, which is I don't know what to think about that, but you know, yeah, it's still an open question. We are working through it and trying to understand how to relate between these things. I really appreciate all the comments, and it's still very much a work in progress. Let's get back to that. So you know. So okay, so this is good because we are right on time, and I think now Mira can take over.
Thanks. Well, I have one student, Robert. Hi. I know you're going to turn your camera on and present. I think that, yeah, like hard stop, different, let's say, process, different things on the board. Take it away, Robert.
Hi, everyone. I'm just gonna jump right in with my thesis statement and then move from there. Let me just share my screen. Can everyone still see my screen or?
Yeah, we see it. It's black right now. Yep, we see it.
And now?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. My thesis is an exploration of how the colors, textures, and sensations of contemporary.
Robert, do you want to go to full screen?
I thought it was on full screen. And now?
No, but maybe that's just the nature of this.
Try hitting Control L.
Yeah, that's what I kept doing, and it keeps
See what it
going
does.
on the screen.
Try again, Control L.
I just hit Control L.
Okay.
Is it? Can you see it, or is it blank?
No, we can see it. We can see it.
Oh,
It's
you
just not full screen, you know. But if you want, you can maybe just hide the right panel, and if you want, then we can see the bigger image then.
Mm-hmm.
Terribly sorry, guys.
Okay.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, it's all the same.
So it can be seen. You can see me scrolling through them, the images.
No, it's still.
Yeah, we just see the first image that says Mark.
Okay, now try scrolling through.
Now it'll work.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is the best I got, guys.
That's great.
Terribly sorry. I'll go on. My thesis is an exploration of how the colors, textures, and sensations of contemporary figurative painter Toyin Odutela's rendering of the human skin through an investigative expansion of her visualization and its cultural context. She describes skin and is further ascribed as peripheral in position and in process, ostracized and particularly rudimentary in conception and composition. Odutela greatly subverts traditional applications of this organ by inferring its deep structure and composition of complexion, but also interpolates a consideration of the human complex itself. This thesis aims to create an architectural experience that embraces a shifting dynamic of decusseting spaces by utilizing and embracing material, chromatical, and spatial interactions within a complex epidermal frontier. I intend to generate experimentally new aesthetic qualities and architectural form language whose genesis is extrapolated from the inside out. Through my thesis, I'm also dealing with the concept of mark making. And by understanding Toyin's ability to create lustrous color and textural qualities on a flat surface, I drew a connection between the mark making in where I'm from, Nigeria. And there's a similarity between Toyin's process, but also the head on the right, which is a mask from the Yoruba tribe of where I'm from. I'm also dealing with the notion of darkness and the notion of dark space by going through readings by Mario Gooden and understanding the Black experience in America, but also the difference also where I'm from, how that experience varies. I'm also using another African painter who is closer to where I'm from. His name is Olalekan Ejiofor. He's also Yoruba. And he makes these massive geopolitical maps that he then overlays a new understanding of architecture onto it. And through my process, I would like to create a kind of expanse based on the complexity of Tony's epidermal structure and combining with Olalekan's geopolitical understanding of a narrative. And I'm using three particular what's it called, references. The Mosque of Cordoba, which is a massive field of columns, and Agadir, the concept designed by OMA, which is also utilizing that same form language and typology. And last would be the Sana Rolex Learning Center. And yeah, from this, I'm creating a kind of, I'm using an understanding of drawing, a kind of temporality of the moment to create these drawings that are both borrowing motifs from Tony's complexion, but also Olalekan's field condition, and creating these drawings that are made in the moment and are made instantaneously. There is no time that passes between each drawing that's made. They're made by hand, and they create a kind of compounding effect. And the aspect of burning as a kind of violence, a kind of permanence, a kind of break in time to uplift what I'm trying to produce. From this, I then go through the process of mining out architectural motifs and other form languages to create an understanding, kind of mapping out process, the same as Olalekan is doing. And moving through that process of understanding what the permanence of these burns will be like in an architectural context. And this is the version of that. And if I could just go to my model, I'd like to show you. From that understanding, I created my miniature based on a design process that comes from the bottom, from the top down. A traditional understanding would be to, based on gravity, have the weight supported from underneath, but I'm kind of trying to go through a design process of designing from the top down instead of the traditional planimetric understanding of designing space from above. And I'm just using my model to kind of express that understanding of materiality and texture, but also kind of an aesthetic. It's just more pictures of the model and the kind of tumultuous qualities that can start to happen when gravity is pulling the paint downward. Thank you.
Robert, do you want to add some potential questions of where you're trying to go? What are some of the questions or challenges moving forward to maybe start to synthesize these different interests and kind of studies?
Yes. So I'm trying to think of scale and what and the kind of condition that would happen of where this building would sit and the kind of consequences of that. I was looking at an area in Nigeria, Makoko, which is a village well, it's not really a village. It's more so of a massive, expansive urban construct that built its own life out of the people there from their own creative processes. It wasn't planned at all. It was just an instant moment of creation. And there's other sites I'm also thinking about. But I'm trying to move away, because right now the project is very symbolic of an understanding of what an architecture could be with regards to like its context. But I'm trying to move away from a symbolic reading towards more of like an actual reading.
It's really interesting to me the relationship between your model and the kind of precedent, the marks, the artworks that you were showing, with the kind of burning to create the effect, or the scorch. Like there's a kind of clear dialogue between those two than with the vector work that you extrapolated from those. You know, because there's a certain amount of performance you're getting by the way the material is interacting with each other. That kind of defies the sort of precise demarcation that you get with the kind of line drawings that you were making as a translation. And it seems like there's like a little bit, maybe two different like kind of schools of production, where like Sejima's projects, and I think Kanazawa, based on your final model, Kanazawa Art Institute maybe is closer towards what you're pursuing, that you have these kind of solid volumes emerging within the plate, rather than the Sana, which is more, or the Rolex, which is more about kind of deforming the plate to create the spatial organization. But that's like their production process is heavily involved with, you know, very clear vector cut, right? Like the X-Acto knife on the foam core to make a specific profile or shape and plan. Where these marks and the thing that you're producing, the model, seems to inhabit like a very different world that I think is really interesting. I also, you know, your model suggests a different understanding of section than I think the precedents that you've shown have. In some way, I feel like the kind of analog to Cordoba is maybe closer to the model and to the artwork, in that you know, the column grid and the arches and vaults at Cordoba are constantly varying, because it emerged out of a kind of market hall architecture of masonry assemblage, right? So it's like individual stone cutters producing every vault and every column slightly different from each other. And I had that kind of material implication, or the mark of the kind of like it's a different kind of culture than the master builder in Renaissance, but the same idea of the architect is the person who's putting the mark into the stone, or the builder putting the mark into the stone. So I think like those projects, I see like a really clear dialogue from, and like how they're working together. I'm curious about the sectional difference between what you're proposing and what you see in the precedents, and like how that, like, do we read the model as a sectional proposal as well as a kind of material exploration of creating this these volume or mark as a spatial construct? And I think that the line drawings actually feel like they are right now contributing less maybe to that dialogue that you're trying to create between those kind of aspects of your process.
Yeah, I think it's a very beautiful work, and it's very sensual. You know, there is this idea of producing this kind of space that is more atmospheric, more experiential, more kind of phenomenological, right? It's not a space of static enclosures. You know, I think it's really interesting, and I do agree with Casey. When it becomes a drawing, it becomes maybe far too much explicit, right? It becomes kind of maybe over-defined, and if you look at some of the Sana drawings, they have this incredible capacity to produce the graphical space, right? With like different line weights and different kind of expressions within that space. And I think that's what you're doing with your burn amazing work here. But when you go into graphical kind of procedure, which is, it was traditionally always thought to be like the domain of the architect, right? That's like, you're treating it in a very like automatic way, I think. And I think there is a space there to explore this like sensual component through that kind of drawing as well. And especially like if you look at maybe some of the Sana, when they draw maybe like a circular envelope, right? It's never a perfect circle, right? There is always this kind of strange but super sensitive kind of deviation from this kind of solid forms, And I think you're able to evoke that, especially in the beautiful model, like the physical model, but also in here in the burn kind of drawing. I think it's a drawing. I think. So I would just treat my if I were you, I would just treat my graphical expression the same way.
Robert, you have a very clear thesis, I think, from the way you started to explain it, articulate your set of precedents into like where you are right now. So I just want to commend you on that. I think there's a lot of opportunity in thinking about a site or a building from origination to kind of its current condition, thinking about those histories and how they can be kind of overlaid. In your material study, you're kind of like small one. I know you're thinking about it in terms of weight, but thinking about in plan and how you derive that from that drawing where you're kind of like marring a surface, also as like a kind of art-based process that deals with time. So like, certain marks become very relevant at a particular moment. I almost want to like cut up that material study into layers and then take these drawings apart also into layers and start to interweave them and like photograph that or look at that and plan how those two things can start to correlate together. I think it'd be really wonderful. I think you're like really there. Everything's kind of ripe, and yeah, the material studies are really wonderful. I think you're set up to, I don't know, really pull in the history and the layering of the site. There's certain significant moments that I think would align quite well with the way that you're dealing with the material and how you're dealing with paint, and it looks like you're almost like kind of like burning into the surface and melting it, which are all like time-based operations.
Yeah, and I fully agree with you, Jeff. I was sort of thinking the same thing about layering. I mean, there are 3 layers in the physical model, but I think the drawing, the burnt drawing, is so powerful that it's sort of asking for more. And I do think that here with the paint, you sort of created the same effect as you did in the 2D drawing with the burnt. So that's very interesting. But I was also thinking like, what happens if fire becomes like your tool to also manipulate the physical model? I mean, controlling it, be safe, but maybe you can explore a little bit what fire creates, because it's sort of a material agency, You are not really in control of fire, the boundaries that it creates, the color gradient that it creates. And I think there might be some opportunity there too. Definitely that burnt drawing that you have is like the strongest part here. But it's very, very interesting. The section, it's really like capturing that essence. So, I mean, the section of the model, that picture we were just seeing.
Thanks, you guys. Maybe a couple of other comments, and I think we're there.
To say quickly, I don't know, Robert and Mira, if you've spoken at all about Darby English and the way he begins that book, How to See a Work of Art in Total Darkness.
Sure.
And, through a reading of that David Hammond's piece, Concerto in Black and Blue, an installation work which is kind of characterized by a very, very, very deep kind of indigo blue optical environment, in which when one enters, the kind of conditions of visibility of oneself, of others, of space are really kind of transformed. And I wonder, your kind of your close-up photograph of the kind of involuted surface of your model seems to me to switch from a kind of schematic view to something that's approaching a kind of experiential, subject-oriented kind of trajectory or destination in your work about the kind of space that this is producing. And I think it's kind of highly evocative. And I think that's a quality you get in Toyin Odutala's works. I think it's a quality that's evoked even in the Benin sculpture that you were showing. And so, you know, I wonder for you if you have a sense yet of how you might begin to describe the kind of space that you're bringing into being from all of these different, through the models, through the drawings, and what you're trying to get to.
Maybe I'll just add one thing. Thank you guys so much for Robert. I think this has been really amazing feedback. One of the things that I think we've been talking about just at the very end of our last set of sessions is the question of whether or not, if working towards a building project, what I think Robert wants to do is whether or not this is actually something that is not a brand new building, but a building that's operating on existing building. That there's sort of idea of the time-based working on something seen rather than it being kind of like total new construction, let's say. And so there is a sort of interplay between the kind of working on a surface, let's say, versus everything being built up. So that's something potentially that I think is potentially in the air. But Robert, I don't know if you want to add anything before we close out.
I just want to say thank you for everyone's comments. What you guys have told me has kind of aligned with what Maya was thinking about and what me and Mira were discussing. So that's fantastic to hear. Brilliant feedback, and I really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you very much.
Cool. Well,
awesome. Thank you, everyone. This was really amazing to participate in. And I want to thank our guests, Augustina, Enrique, and Jeff, and William, who was here just until recently, and also John Cooper, who joined at some point. And yeah, I hope that we will see you very soon in the next iteration of this. And if Mira or Casey have some other points to make, we can.
No, I like this. This was great, you guys.
Yep, thank you everybody for coming. It's great to see you guys again.
Very generous jury. Really nice.
Pretty awesome.
Really.
Thanks for having me.
Thank
awesome.
you.
Thank you, everyone. See you soon.
Bye. Stay
Bye.
safe.